The wind reached the line before the tanks did. It slid through the birch trunks like a warning, tugging at torn greatcoats, carrying needles of frozen snow into tired eyes. Somewhere on the Western Front, not far from Vyazma, the autumn of 1941 had given up pretending to be autumn and gone straight into winter. The trenches weren't really trenches anymore, more like shallow scratches in frozen mud, edged by broken carts, shattered logs, and the black hulls of burnt-out vehicles that nobody had had time to drag away. Near one of those burned wagons, half sunk into the snow, a young Red Army rifleman shifted the weight of what his comrades jokingly called the iron fence post. The P-30 41 lay across the low rise in front of him, all barrel and bipod and splinters of raw wood. Almost 2 meters of steel, nearly 17 kilograms of weight, a single shot each time. When he had first been issued the thing, someone in his platoon had leaned on it like a walking stick and called it a cane for giants. Someone else had suggested it would make a better chimney support than a weapon. Nobody had argued. Now, nobody laughed. He lay prone behind it, cheek pressed to the rough stock, trying to ignore the way his shoulder still throbbed from training shots taken in warmer weather. Beside him, his loader, a kid who looked even younger with his helmet pushed down over his ears, touched the heavy 14.5mm cartridge pouches like a man counting coins he can't afford to waste. Somewhere beyond the tree line, engines grumbled. Not loud yet, but insistent. The kind of sound that made the ground carry a faint vibration before your ears could pick it up. The battery of proper anti-tank guns that had once covered this sector was gone. Some destroyed, some withdrawn, some simply overrun. What remained on this stretch of line was a handful of rifles, a scattering of grenades, and infantry who had been retreating so long they had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand still. The rifleman eased the PTRD's bipod into the frozen crust. The legs bit in with a crunch that sounded too loud in the still air. Snow dusted the long barrel, clinging to the muzzle brake in tiny crystals. The loader slid the first cartridge into the open breech with exaggerated care, the brass casing dull in the flat light. The heavy bolt closed with a single, sharp click. That sound made the loader flinch, even though he knew it was coming. Headlights flickered between the trees, smeared by fog and drifting snow. A small shape nosed out first, not the largest tank in the German arsenal, but still a tracked vehicle of steel and noise and forward motion. The turret turned lazily, searchlight beginning to sweep the ridge in slow arcs. The rifleman breathed in cold that burned his throat. His left hand locked around the fore end. His right finger settled on the trigger, taking up slack until any extra pressure would send the 14.5mm dart down range. One shot. Then a long pause to reload. If he missed, the tank would close the distance, and the rifle would become nothing more than an awkward length of metal to hide behind. He waited for the angle he wanted, not the thickest plate at the front, but a seam where steel joined steel. The loader had shown him, tracing diagrams in the dirt. Here the armor is generous, he had said with a crooked grin. Here it wears a thin coat. The sight picture steadied. The world shrank to reticle, silhouette, and the faint shimmer of exhaust. The rifleman exhaled and pressed. The blast hit his shoulder like a hammer wrapped in ice. The muzzle flash turned the snow in front of the ridge into a brief, orange-white cloud. The enormous casing bounced out and hissed as it hit the frost. A heartbeat later, a flat metallic crack came back across the clearing. The tank stuttered. Tracks ground once, then again, then slowed. Steam vented from somewhere under its hull. The turret gave a hesitant twitch, then stopped halfway through a turn. A hatch flew open. A dark figure clambered into the snow, stumbled, and crawled away from the vehicle as smoke drifted from behind the armor. The rifleman didn't celebrate. His shoulder screamed, and the world rang in his ears. But he kept his cheek welded to the stock. Next, he muttered. The loader already had another round in his hands. The cartridge slid into the empty breech. The bolt closed again. Engine noise was rising. That first vehicle had not been alone. Larger silhouettes shifted between the trunks, the snow changing color as headlights cut through it. Behind the ridge, rifles clicked, bolts slid, grenades were shifted into more convenient pockets. The PTRD, ridiculous and oversized in the training yard, suddenly felt very small compared to the shapes pushing out of the forest. The wind shifted, blowing snow into his face. The rifleman blinked it away and settled the long barrel again. The Germans had numbers, fuel, and doctrine. On this ridge, in this moment, he had one narrow weapon and a handful of cartridges. He leaned into the stock, and the forest seemed to inhale with him, waiting to see whether this oddly long rifle would remain a joke, or become the thin line that held the night together. Long before that ridge turned the PTRD into something close to a legend, the weapon had already been written off on paper. In the late 1930s, Soviet planners believed they understood where warfare was going. Tanks were getting heavier, armor thicker. What chance, they argued, did a man with a rifle have against a machine whose plates had to be hoisted into place by cranes? The Spanish Civil War and early testing had already suggested that anti-tank rifles were on the way out. Big shells and proper guns, yes. Shoulder-fired weapons? That felt like a relic from another era. Official memoranda reflected that attitude. Some officers described anti-tank rifles as transitional solutions, something that might have been useful years ago but would soon be overtaken by thicker armor and higher velocities. In conference rooms far from the front, the future looked like neat arrows on maps, backed by massed formations of tanks and artillery. In that tidy future, there wasn't much room for a single soldier lying in the snow with a long gun and a bruised shoulder. Then June 1941 arrived, and with it, reality. Operation Barbarossa tore through the western districts faster than pre-war exercises had ever imagined. Defensive lines dissolved, depots were abandoned in haste, and entire artillery parks were left behind in the rush to avoid encirclement. Once secure assumptions about how many guns would be available to stop armored columns crumbled alongside command posts and headquarters. Shocked by the speed and depth of the German advance, the Soviet leadership began re-evaluating anything that could be put between a tank and a road. Design bureaus that had filed anti-tank rifle projects under low priority suddenly found those files pulled back onto desks, now stamped urgent. Blueprints were revisited, prototypes dusted off, calculations rerun with one question in mind: what could be built quickly, cheaply, and in vast numbers, even if it wasn't perfect? Two designs emerged from this rush: the semi-automatic PTRS and the single-shot PTRD. Both were chambered for the same 14.5mm round originally developed for anti-aircraft work and heavy machine guns. On paper, the PTRS was the more advanced system: quicker follow-up shots, more modern engineering. In practice, it was complex, sensitive to dirt, and more demanding on factories. The PTRD, by contrast, was brutally simple. One massive bolt, one equally massive cartridge, a long barrel, a bipod, and a stock strong enough to transmit every bit of recoil into the shooter's body. It could be machined with less effort, maintained with fewer tools, and understood by soldiers with minimal training. When compromises had to be made, simplicity won. Somewhere in that desperate summer, a decision was made. Imperfect steel now was better than perfect theory next year. Factories were relocated east, machines tore into steel billets, and production orders rolled out with a speed that would have seemed unrealistic just months earlier. The PTRD was not treated like a carefully refined masterpiece. It was treated like a bucket for a house on fire. You did not argue about the bucket's elegance when the walls were already smoking. A few weeks later, crates marked with rough stencils began arriving at training grounds and forward depots. The rifleman from the ridge first saw the PTRD in one of those yards. The instructor, a sergeant whose voice had long ago been flattened into a permanent shout, had walked up and down the line of weapons like a man introducing farm tools. "This one, comrades, is the anti-tank rifle," he barked. "It is longer than you, heavier than your blanket, and it will treat your shoulder worse than your political officer treats your paperwork. But it can put a hole through things that make you nervous. That makes it your friend." The first time the rifleman shouldered it, the weapon did indeed feel ridiculous. It seemed to go on forever past the front sight. When he lay prone, there was barely room between the muzzle and the berm. Reaching for the bolt meant stretching farther than felt natural. The sergeant insisted they practice, round after round, until a bruised discoloration bloomed across each trainee's upper arm. Recoil, they were told, was the tax they would pay for being able to push metal through metal. They also learned when not to shoot. The instructors were frank. "You will meet machines," one said, tracing rough outlines in the dust. "This part here," he tapped the thick front of a drawn hull, "is for proper guns. You do not have proper guns. You have this thing. So you are going to aim at what your weapon can actually influence." They were shown sketches of vision slits, ventilation grills, track assemblies, and thin vertical panels. They practiced identifying likely weak spots on photographs and on wooden silhouettes hammered together from scrap. Hit the running gear, and the vehicle stops. Hit the engine vents, and maybe the heat inside climbs where it shouldn't. Hit the turret ring at the right angle, and mechanisms might lock. Nobody promised miracles. Nobody said this rifle would turn tanks into paper. The promise was much smaller and far more important. If you used it well, you could force steel to hesitate. And sometimes, hesitation was all that separated a platoon from being overrun. When the rifleman left training and marched west, his memories of those lessons blended with the ache in his shoulder and the weight of the PTRD on his back. It creaked in its sling as he trudged along frozen roads. At night, he propped it inside dugouts like a third person, the long barrel disappearing into the shadows above him. By the time he reached the ridge near Vyazma, he had fired the weapon enough times to stop flinching at the blast. What he hadn't yet done was aim it at a real tank. That changed when the snow came and the engines began to roll toward his sector, pushing doctrine and theory aside so that raw practice could answer a simple question. Had that ridiculous rifle been a waste of precious metal, or was it about to justify every bruise and every hour spent at the training berm? When German armor first cut into Soviet territory in 1941, the imbalance between doctrine and reality was not just on one side. Inside their machines, German crews had their own expectations. Many of them had fought in Poland and France. They had seen anti-tank rifles before, in other armies' hands. To them, those weapons were tools that threatened early light tanks, the kind with thin plates more suited to resisting rifle bullets than dedicated penetrators. By 1941, they believed they had moved beyond that era. Their vehicles carried thicker armor, better guns, and the momentum of prior victories. At crew briefings, when officers spoke about likely threats, they focused on artillery, mines, and the occasional well-hidden gun in a tree line. An isolated soldier with a long rifle was mentioned, if at all, as an inconvenience, something for accompanying infantry to watch for while the tank itself concentrated on larger targets. This confidence was not entirely unjustified. The front defenses of mid-war German vehicles were indeed designed to shrug off small-caliber fire. Plates were angled, thickness increased. The belief that anti-tank rifles had limited relevance meshed with the physical reality of their machines. Once an assumption wears the armor of steel itself, it becomes hard to pierce. Back on the Soviet side of the ridge, the PTRD teams were learning to work around that reality. The rifleman and his loader had spent their first week on the line practicing movement with the unwieldy weapon in real terrain instead of on a neat training field. In the forest, the long barrel snagged on branches. In ruined villages, doorway angles and broken walls forced them to invent ways to pivot the rifle into firing positions without exposing themselves too much. They discovered that the rifle was less a single object and more a shared task. The loader carried extra ammunition and, when needed, helped support the barrel as the shooter adjusted his angle in the snow. The shooter, in turn, learned to trust his partner's voice when it came time to pick priority targets. Their section leader, an older corporal who had survived earlier phases of the fighting, hammered one idea into them. Mobility mattered as much as marksmanship. If they see the muzzle flash, he said, they will answer. Maybe with a tank shell, maybe with mortars, maybe with something else. So remember this, you are not a statue. You are a question mark. You appear, you ask your question in steel, and then you are somewhere else before they respond. So they rehearsed not just firing, but what happened in the 3 seconds after. Lift the bipod, roll sideways, crawl back, choose another patch of ground. Reload not where you shot, but 5 meters away, behind another stump or fold in the earth. The rifle's weight made this tiring work, especially in snow that fought every movement, but the alternative, staying put and trusting luck, appealed to nobody. In quieter moments, the rifleman would run his fingers along the grooves of the barrel, feeling where the machining marks caught bits of ice. The weapon lacked the smooth finishes shown in factory posters. It bore the signs of a production line that had traded polish for speed. Yet the bore itself was straight, the bolt locked firmly, and the trigger broke the same way each time. Those were the details he cared about. The first battle at the ridge proved that training could only carry them so far. The rest would be decided by nerves and improvisation. After the light tank stalled under his first shot and the second vehicle rolled forward with heavier framing and more confidence, the rifleman discovered that theory about weak spots felt different when the machine you were aiming at was turning its gun in your direction. His second shot of the night had glanced off, sparking against armor that shrugged it off like rain. The feedback was immediate, a flare of noise as the enemy vehicle advanced with renewed certainty, convinced that whatever had struck it was insufficient to matter. The incentive to panic was overwhelming. Instead, he and his loader fell back into the rhythm hammered into them at the training ground. The loader had already cracked open the breech as the rifle recoiled, catching the spent casing before it melted into the snow. His hand found another cartridge by touch. The rifleman dragged the weapon slightly to one side, angling for a clearer view of the tracks rather than the armored hull. The third shot of the engagement was not aimed at crew or turret. It was aimed at mobility. The round struck the track assembly with a noise more like an axe hitting a rail than a bullet hitting a plate. Links jumped free, metal sagged, and the tank's forward drive turned into a dragging limp. It did not fall silent. Its engine roared, its turret continued to swivel, and its machine guns continued to chatter. But it no longer rolled freely toward the ridge. It had been forced to negotiate the ground, not dictate terms to it. Behind the rifleman, grenades arced out from shallow pits, landing near the immobilized vehicle. The noise that followed was less clean than the sharp crack of a rifle, but just as effective. The tank's silhouette shifted, then settled awkwardly against the contours of the snow-covered slope. The rifleman learned something important in that moment. Stopping a tank did not always mean turning it into a burning wreck. Sometimes, it meant forcing it to sit in the wrong place at the wrong time, where other weapons could reach it or where it could no longer support its own infantry. That understanding would be repeated across dozens of winter fields in the months to come. PTRD teams would not always be credited with outright destruction in reports. Often their actions were wrapped into phrases like vehicle disabled or enemy formation delayed. The rifleman lying in the snow with a bruised shoulder rarely saw how those short lines in an after-action summary rippled through an entire sector's timetable. He only knew the immediate, the hot smell of propellant, the weight of the bolt in his hand, and the knowledge that somewhere inside the armor he had just struck, gears had skipped, bearings had protested, or metal had bent. As night deepened around the ridge, and taller German vehicles joined the battle, the rifleman realized that his extra-long iron cane was teaching him something the training field could not. Even when you lack the power to smash through the strongest point of an obstacle, you can still shape its options, slow its pace, and make its crew feel less certain about every meter they advance. The winter of 1941 to 1942 turned the PTRD from an emergency improvisation into a regular feature of the Eastern Front. As the first batches proved that they could influence real battles, production grew. Factories east of the Volga retooled assembly lines that had once produced civilian goods, turning out rifle barrels instead of agricultural machinery. Workers assembled stocks in workshops that had once cut furniture. Entire trainloads of these awkward weapons rolled west under canvas covers, accompanied by crates of ammunition whose dimensions felt closer to small tools than to bullets. At the front, commanders began to weave them into their defensive patterns more deliberately. In earlier months, anti-tank rifles had been scattered almost at random, handed to whoever happened to be nearby when a crate was opened. Now, dedicated two-man teams were designated in each company, then in each battalion. Simple standing orders evolved. For every likely road or open field, identify at least one firing point where a PTRD team could lie unnoticed until engines were close enough to engage. The rifleman from the ridge found himself, unexpectedly, in the role of instructor. He was not promoted. His collar tabs remained the same. But experience is its own kind of rank. After a few engagements, when it became clear that he knew how to make the rifle work under stress, new arrivals were ushered toward him with their fresh bruises and half-learned drills. He showed them the practical details the manuals only hinted at. How to pack snow under the bipod so that recoil did not drive the weapon deeper into the ground at a strange angle. How to choose a patch of earth where the barrel could be depressed or elevated quickly without running into a rock or a tree stump. How to use bits of cloth or foliage to soften the outline of the long barrel without interfering with the muzzle brake. He made them dry fire in thin gloves and in thick, because he knew that fingers felt different when numb. He had them practice sighting with snow blowing into their faces because he remembered his own first battle, when the weather itself had felt like a third opponent alongside the tank and the clock. The loader, too, became a teacher. He showed newcomers how to cradle cartridges so that they did not slip from cold hands, how to position themselves beside the shooter to avoid the worst of the blast, how to move in tandem when it was time to reposition. In constant movement, the rifle proved less like a gun and more like a pole being carried by two people across broken ground. The rifleman also learned where the PTRD was not the answer. In some engagements, German armor approached that was clearly beyond the rifle's capabilities from the angles available. He saw rounds bounce off thick frontal plates with only a smear of scraped paint to show for the attempt. He felt the temptation to keep firing anyway, if only to feel that something was being done. Instead, he learned to save his ammunition for shots that might matter. Track links, side holes at close to perpendicular angles, rear plates when a vehicle turned under pressure. Sometimes the most important decision he made in an entire day was not to take a shot that would have given away his position for no gain. That discipline extended beyond his own team. When German units committed full companies of tanks, the PTRD was only one piece of the defense. Mines, artillery, and anti-tank guns did most of the heavy lifting against the heaviest vehicles. But the presence of rifle teams along the flanks and in secondary positions meant that even tanks that slipped through the main fire zone were not safe. The rifleman listened to officers discussing this in the margins of maps. They spoke of adding depth to the defense, of complicating the enemy's advance. The PTRD, with its single shot and demanding recoil, was part of that depth. He saw its impact most clearly not in the big set-piece battles, although it was present there, but in the countless smaller actions that rarely made it into official history. A platoon caught on a road when a Thor turned the flanks into mud. A convoy of lighter vehicles pressed into armoured rolls because proper tanks were needed elsewhere. A lone armoured car reaching too far ahead of its infantry support. In those moments, a team with a long rifle could turn a quick German probe into a stalled exchange, buying minutes for the rest of the line to adjust. A mobility kill on the lead vehicle of a narrow track forced those behind to either attempt risky detours or back away under fire. A shot into an engine block on a half-track denied the enemy a mobile machine gun platform. Those were not the kind of exploits that produced dramatic headlines. They did not involve entire divisions changing direction, but stitched together across dozens of kilometers and hundreds of days, they formed a kind of invisible net. Tanks that had once driven with near impunity now had to consider that even if they pushed past the obvious gun positions, stray rifle teams might still be waiting in folds of ground or behind isolated barns. The rifleman noticed a quieter change as well. In the early days, villagers and fresh conscripts had looked at the PTRD with amusement or skepticism. Some had tapped the barrel and made jokes about it doubling as a flagpole when the war ended. After a winter's worth of engagements, the tone was different. When locals saw him and his loader carrying the long weapon through their streets, they stepped aside with a respect usually reserved for full-size guns. Some would gesture toward distant fields and whisper that tanks came from there last time. The rifle, in their minds, had earned its place alongside larger artillery as a kind of talisman against steel. On quiet nights, when he had a minute to sit with his back against a dugout wall and rub his sore shoulder, the rifleman would glance at the weapon leaning nearby and think about the strange path that had brought it there. Conceived in skepticism, built in haste, delivered in crates to a front that was already on fire, the PTRD had moved from being considered outdated to being one of the few tools ready when the line needed something, anything, to make steel hesitate. He knew it was not perfect. He knew bigger and better weapons were being designed even as he lay in the snow. But he also knew that they were still only drawings, while his ridiculous rifle was very real and very loud, wherever a German crew underestimated what might be waiting for them beyond the next rise. On the other side of the battlefield, German reports were beginning to show a shift in tone, even if they did not yet fully understand the scope of what they were facing. Early after-action summaries from 1941 and early 1942 described rifle-caliber anti-tank fire as something largely relevant to lighter vehicles. Crews recorded occasional cracked viewports or damaged external fittings, but the language carried an underlying assumption. Serious threats came from guns with carriages and crews in uniforms dusted with artillery soot, not from a single soldier in a snowbank. As the months went on, that assumption started to fray around the edges. Platoon leaders began noting instances where tracks failed seemingly without reason in areas that had not been heavily mined. Technical officers inspecting the damaged running gear found clean, sharp impacts consistent with solid projectiles, not blast patterns. Reports from reconnaissance units mentioned isolated shots that seemed to come from nowhere, striking side hulls or rear plates at disconcerting ranges. The word Gehörgranate, rifle grenade, appeared frequently in explanations, because it fit what analysts already believed about Soviet infantry capabilities. A dedicated anti-tank rifle with a 14.5mm bore firing purpose-made armor-piercing rounds required a deeper revision of prior assumptions, and that sort of revision is never easy in wartime. Meanwhile, at the front edge, tank crews were adjusting in more immediate ways. One commander, pushing his medium tank through the outskirts of a village, felt his vehicle jolt hard to one side even though he had not heard the telltale thump of a mine. The driver reported that one track had tightened strangely, then jammed. When they later inspected the running gear, they found a link shattered and bent inward, torn by a solid strike near its joint. Another crew, escorting trucks along a forest road, abruptly lost power when their engine temperature spiked without obvious cause. Only after the vehicle was towed back and mechanics opened the compartment Did they find a narrow hole in a ventilation grill and a distorted path through pipes and casings that suggested a small number of well-placed shots had done more damage than an entire belt of machine gun fire would have? Each episode on its own looked like a nuisance. Collectively, they hinted at a pattern. Somewhere out there, Soviet infantry had access to a weapon that could reach out farther and hit harder than conventional rifles and machine guns, and they were learning where to aim. German doctrine adapted slowly. Tank units began to insist more strongly on close infantry support when moving through areas where such threats were likely. Commanders reminded crews to avoid presenting side armor unnecessarily when passing open ground. Orders emphasized the importance of speed through danger zones, where isolated shots could be expected from hidden positions. But the practical demands of the Eastern Front often dragged behavior back toward risk. Fuel shortages and time pressure meant that tanks could not always wait for perfectly coordinated advances. Roads had to be used even when flanking fields looked suspicious. Lighter vehicles had to be sent ahead to test routes. That constant tension between what doctrine recommended and what the situation demanded created openings that rifle teams could exploit. For the PTRD crews, each such opening looked different. Sometimes it was a single tank cresting a ridge with its infantry lagging behind. Sometimes it was a column of half-tracks pressed into roles for which they were never designed. In those moments, the rifleman's long training sessions dissolved into one simple question. Could he line up sights on a vulnerable part of the moving shape before it closed the distance? And could his loader keep pace with the demands of firing, reloading, and shifting position under stress? He and his loader developed small, almost wordless routines to make those decisions faster. When they heard engines at a distance, the loader would already begin checking cartridges, making sure the next few rounds were easy to grab in sequence. The rifleman would scan for angles that offered side views rather than head-on confrontations. They learned how different vehicles sounded: the deeper hum of heavier tanks, the higher pitch of lighter armored cars, the rattling clatter of trucks. Sometimes, when all the conditions lined up, good cover, a clear angle on the flank, a cooperative slice of terrain, the PTRD could do more than harass. It could genuinely neutralize a vehicle in a way that crews would remember long after the battle. A medium tank hit in the side hull at modest range might suffer an internal failure that immobilized it entirely. A half-track struck in its engine block could turn from a mobile firing platform into a static obstacle. Those incidents, repeated along a front hundreds of kilometers long, contributed to a subtle but important shift in German armored behavior. Tanks that had once been used for quick, deep thrusts began to move more cautiously in areas known to be thick with infantry. Columns that previously might have pushed down a visible road through a village now hesitated, sending scouts ahead to probe for ambushes. From the perspective of high command, this looked like an understandable adjustment to the challenges of fighting in a vast theater. From the perspective of a PTRD team, it looked like proof that their ridiculous rifle was doing more than bruising shoulders. It was bruising confidence. The rifleman did not read German reports. He had no way of knowing how his shots were interpreted on the other side. But he could tell from the behavior of the tanks facing him that they no longer drove as boldly as they had in the first weeks after the invasion began. When he told new recruits they are not untouchable, he meant it literally and figuratively. Steel might still be thick, but somewhere inside each moving hull was a small awareness that even in the open spaces where tanks were supposed to dominate, there were now pockets of resistance capable of reaching out with one long barrel and reminding them that the battlefield belonged to more than just armor. The PTRD story did not unfold only in forests and on snowbound ridges. It cut through villages, across open fields, and even along improvised airstrips, wherever the front line bent and shifted. By mid-war, the rifleman found himself far from the sector where he had first fired the weapon in anger. Units were rotated, positions overrun, new lines drawn. Every time he arrived at a new location, the terrain changed, but the basic problems remained the same: how to face tracked vehicles with a tool designed for a single carefully aimed shot. One phase of the fighting brought his team to the edge of a small settlement that had been evacuated in haste. Houses leaned at odd angles, some burned to frames, others merely abandoned, their doors swinging in the wind. The road through the village was the only path firm enough for heavy vehicles. Fields on either side had turned into mud that swallowed boots to the ankles and threatened to trap anything heavier. Command recognized an opportunity. If they could deny that road to German armor, the village could become a temporary anchor for the defensive line. If they failed, the settlement would turn into just another waypoint in the enemy's advance. Artillery had limited coverage this far out. Mines were in short supply. But the battalion had several PTRD teams and the willingness to use them in ways the training brochures had not illustrated. The rifleman and his loader were assigned to an upstairs room of a partially collapsed house overlooking a bend in the main street. The floorboards creaked under the rifle's weight. They used broken furniture to reinforce the floor beneath their chosen firing spot, spreading the recoil across as many beams as possible. A missing section of wall provided a wide field of fire, but also exposure, so they hung tattered curtains in front of the opening and cut a small slit through which the barrel could protrude. The arrangement looked unstable, and it was. The PTRD was designed to be fired from solid earth, not cramped interior spaces. But necessity outweighed comfort. From this perch, they could see a stretch of road that any vehicle would have to use. They could also see enough of the flanking fields to judge whether the ground would tolerate attempts to bypass the village. When the first German vehicles arrived, they were not heavy tanks but a pair of half-tracks escorting trucks. Their crews likely expected small arms fire and perhaps a few grenades from stubborn defenders, not high-velocity penetrators from above. The rifleman aimed not at the helmets visible above the side armor, but at the front of the leading vehicle. His first shot punched into the engine compartment, sending a jet of steam and smoke out from under the front hood. The half-track jerked to a halt, blocking the road. The second shot, taken after a rapid reload while the loader whispered the range estimates, targeted the track assembly of the trailing vehicle. Links snapped and sagged, and the half-track slewed sideways, its wheels biting into the soft verge until it stuck at an angle. In the span of less than a minute, the road through the village had become a tangled obstacle course of metal. Infantry on both sides responded. German soldiers spread out from the stranded vehicles, seeking cover behind walls and fences. Soviet riflemen opened fire from ground-level positions, using the immobilized half-tracks as partial shields. The PTRD, after those first decisive shots, fell mostly silent. The confined space of the attic and the collapse of parts of the ceiling after each recoil made continuing fire risky. Yet the effect of those initial impacts lingered long after the rifle's barrel cooled. The blocked road forced subsequent vehicles to halt short of the village, dismount their infantry earlier, and reconsider their approach entirely. For that afternoon, the settlement held, not because the rifle had destroyed entire platoons of tanks, but because it had reshaped a single segment of road into something hostile to heavy steel. In another sector, months later, the riflemen's team found themselves near an improvised airstrip, tasked with a different sort of target. Aircraft on the ground. Enemy ground attack planes had been using the strip to harass nearby positions. Conventional anti-aircraft guns were scarce. Command asked whether PTRD teams could contribute. The rifleman and his loader were skeptical. The rifle was designed for armor, not wings. But the 14.5mm round carried enough energy to threaten more than just plate steel. Fuel tanks, exposed engines, and control surfaces were all vulnerable if struck correctly. They took up positions along the tree line bordering the strip. When a group of aircraft taxied into place, preparing for takeoff, the rifleman aimed not at the fuselage but at the front of the nearest engine. His shot tore into the housing, sending parts spinning and forcing the aircraft to abort its roll. Other teams targeted landing gear, fuel lines, or control surfaces. In the scramble that followed, some aircraft remained grounded long enough for artillery observers to adjust their fire. Once again, the rifle did not act alone, but as part of a system of small, interlocking efforts that collectively denied the enemy easy use of a key asset. Each such engagement widened the PTRD's reputation among Soviet troops. It was no longer just the tool brought out when tanks appeared on the horizon. It became an all-purpose answer to the question, what can we use to hurt something made of metal that is important to the enemy? For the rifleman, this versatility had a personal cost. His shoulder never fully stopped aching now. The repeated recoil, winter after winter, left a deep, persistent soreness that even field bandages and occasional rest could not erase. His hearing, too, had softened around the edges, high-pitched sounds becoming harder to distinguish after so many blasts close to his head. Yet when officers discussed reorganizing units or redistributing equipment, and someone suggested that he might transfer to another role, the rifleman always shook his head. There was a strange reassurance in the familiar weight of the PTRD, in the practiced motions of its bolt, in the way the world narrowed every time he looked down at sights. He had become, in the language of the staff officers, a specialist. To his comrades, he was simply the one with the long rifle who makes noisy things quiet. As the war ground on and both sides adjusted, the PTRD gradually began to brush up against the limits of what a single soldier's shoulder-fired weapon could do against evolving armor. Newer German models appeared whose frontal plates and carefully angled sides shrugged off even the 14.5mm round at most combat ranges. Commanders passed along new guidance: focus on tracks, rear hulls, and lighter vehicles. Do not waste shots on the thickest parts of the heaviest tanks unless circumstances force you into very close range. On paper, this sounded straightforward. In practice, it meant that PTRD crews had to become even more selective about when and where they engaged. The rifleman learned to read silhouettes quickly. The outline of a heavier tank against the horizon told him that he should be thinking about movement and flanking shots rather than hoping for a clean hull penetration. The shape of a lighter support vehicle, on the other hand, signaled that his rifle could still be decisive at longer distances. During one engagement in mildly rolling terrain, this distinction played out in stark relief. A mixed German column advanced along a shallow valley, a few heavier tanks in the lead, followed by lighter armored vehicles and trucks. Directly confronting the leading machines with the PTRD from his current position would have been largely symbolic. But the rifleman knew something about how columns behaved on narrow routes. The disappearance or delay of certain types of vehicle at the wrong time could disrupt entire formations. He and his loader waited until the lead tanks had passed beyond their immediate area of fire. Engaging them would have meant revealing their position and drawing attention away from more vulnerable targets. Instead, they focused on the vehicles in the middle of the column. A well-placed shot into the side of an ammunition carrier's cab sent that truck careening off the path, blocking an improvised bypass. A second shot, taken from a slightly adjusted position, severed the track of a support vehicle that had just begun to accelerate, causing it to skew sideways across the narrowest part of the valley. Behind them, horns blared. Engines revved and then choked as drivers realized their path was obstructed. The heavy tanks at the front, unaware of the precise nature of the disruption behind, found themselves temporarily isolated. Soviet units, observing the resulting compression from other positions, adjusted their own fire. Artillery shifted to focus on the trap cluster. Infantry assaulted parts of the column that had been forced to halt in exposed locations. For the rifleman and his loader, the engagement consisted of only a handful of carefully aimed shots. For the larger formation, those shots reshaped the fight's tempo. In other settings, the PTRD filled more personal roles. As Soviet forces pushed westward in later years, fortified villages and strongpoints became more common. German defensive works often incorporated steel doors, firing slits, and makeshift armored covers scavenged from damaged vehicles. A heavy rifle round could deform or dislodge such improvised protections in ways ordinary small arms could not. In one such village fight, the rifleman was assigned to support an assault group tasked with clearing a building that had been reinforced with metal sheets over its windows. The infantry could reach the walls, but every attempt to approach the entrances drew fire from concealed positions inside. Instead of trying to hit unseen occupants through narrow openings, the rifleman took aim at the metal coverings themselves. Each shot buckled or tore at the edges of plates, widening cracks and loosening fastenings until grenades and small arms could follow through. The rifle's role in this fight looked nothing like its original mission on the training ground, but it was no less valuable. The gradual shift from tank killer to multi-purpose heavy rifle reflected a broader change in the war. Where once German armored units had been the primary driving force of offensives, fuel shortages and attrition reduced their ability to dominate every engagement. More and more, static defenses, small local counterattacks, and carefully prepared strongpoints formed the backbone of resistance. The PTRD adapted along with the conflict. When armor was present, it targeted movement and vulnerable aspects. When armor was scarce, it served as a tool to cut through steel in other forms: plates, hatches, engine blocks, or even distant machine gun nests shielded by light metal. The rifleman, who had once thought of the PTRD purely in terms of tanks, found that he now reached for it instinctively whenever he heard the phrase "too solid for ordinary fire." It had become his answer to a wide variety of questions. That did not mean the weapon's limitations vanished. In the last year of the war, he more often found himself watching the heaviest German tanks pass at distances where his rifle could not meaningfully influence them, trusting that other weapons would handle that task. But he no longer felt irrelevant when those machines appeared. The front was now thick with artillery and self-propelled guns that could do what his PTRD no longer could. His rifle, meanwhile, continued to find its place in the smaller gaps that remained. He noticed something else as the calendar advanced and the Red Army moved west. The number of PTRDs in his own unit slowly declined. Some were lost in combat. Some wore out mechanically after years of hard use in all weather. Others were collected and moved to rear units as newer systems began to appear at the front. The rifleman understood the logic. More modern weapons with greater penetration and explosive effects were better suited to the evolving demands of the war. Even so, when he was offered the chance to trade his long rifle for a different role as they approached the final campaigns, he hesitated. The PTRD had been his constant companion through retreats, stand-up defenses, and advances alike. It had bruised him and saved him in equal measure. He ultimately chose to keep it, even if by then it was officially listed as secondary equipment. No longer the first answer against the heaviest armor, the PTRD had become something else, a symbol of a time when the line between collapse and survival had been thin enough for one long barrel, fired at the right moment, to make a measurable difference. Once the fighting in Europe finally settled into armistice, weapons that had seemed essential only months before began to look different under peacetime light. Tanks were paraded, aircraft flyovers choreographed, new self-propelled guns rolled across reviewing grounds. Uniforms gleamed. Speeches were made about modern combined arms and the future of warfare. In that setting, the PTRD could easily have vanished into the background, one utilitarian tool among many that had carried the Red Army from the outskirts of Moscow to the heart of Central Europe. Yet for those who had relied on it, the weapon carried an emotional weight that outlasted its official service life. The rifleman was eventually demobilized, his long journey ending not with a dramatic final shot, but with paperwork and a train ride. Before turning in his equipment, he found himself in a storage yard stacked with familiar weapons. Some leaned against each other, their barrels forming ragged triangles against the sky. Others lay in wooden racks, oiled and tagged. He recognized the variations: older rifles with worn stocks, newer ones with slightly smoother finishing from later production runs. Some bore dents and scratches that hinted at hard service. Others looked as if they had never left training grounds. He ran a gloved hand along the length of one barrel, then another, before coming to rest on his own. He knew it not by any official marking, but by the fine cracks in the stock where he had once tightened a field repair with makeshift bindings. Standing in that yard, with the war behind him, he could recall each phase of the weapon's story as clearly as if it were playing out again in snow and smoke. The skeptical laughter in training, the first-time armor stalled under its impact, the long, cold nights where each cartridge felt heavier than food, the cramped attic where its shots had turned vehicles into roadblocks, the fortified buildings whose steel lips had bent under its pressure. He also remembered the times it had done nothing more than thump his shoulder and carve grooves in the snow, its rounds bouncing off armor that had outgrown it. Those memories did not make him think less of the rifle. They reminded him that no tool remains suited to all tasks forever. Historians and designers would later debate the true effectiveness of anti-tank rifles in the Second World War. Charts and tables would be drawn up comparing penetration figures, armor thickness, and hit probabilities. In some of those discussions, the conclusion would be that such weapons were transitional, quickly overtaken by increasing protection and the rise of more advanced anti-armor systems. There was truth to that assessment, in broad terms. But for the rifleman and his peers, the value of the PTRD lay in a narrower window of time, when heavier systems were scarce and the front line needed something it could carry on its shoulders. In that window, from the desperate months of 1941 into the grinding struggles that followed, the ridiculous rifle had imposed a price on German armor that went beyond the physical damage recorded in repair logs. It had forced crews to think twice before driving into certain spaces. It had turned quiet snowbanks and broken walls into places where a single well-placed shot could alter a company's plans. It had given infantry, who might otherwise have felt entirely exposed before steel, a means to impose themselves on machines that towered over them. Its effect was cumulative and psychological as much as kinetic. German tank officers, interviewed after the war, sometimes mentioned Soviet anti-tank rifles in passing, as annoyances, as contributors to track damage, as reasons they preferred to wait for infantry to clear certain areas. None of them credited those rifles alone with halting their operations. But many describe a shift from the early months, when they assumed they could use roads and open fields with minimal risk, to later stages, when they expected that any approach might be watched by a long barrel in a ditch. For modern readers used to thinking of anti-armor as the domain of guided missiles and shaped charges, it can be hard to imagine how a single bolt-action rifle could inspire that kind of caution. The answer lies not in isolated statistics, but in the way industrial war multiplies even modest contributions when they are repeated at scale. Tens of thousands of PTRDs were built and distributed. Not all were used effectively. Not all found themselves in the hands of skilled crews. But enough were in the right place at the right time, often enough, to leave an impression on both sides. The rifleman could not see that whole pattern. He knew only his own path through it. When he finally set his weapon down on the rack and stepped away, he did so with the quiet certainty that whatever future conflicts brought in terms of technology, the memory of what he and others had accomplished with this long, simple rifle would remain part of the story of how one country survived the hardest years of the war. In later decades, when he occasionally saw a PTRD displayed in a museum or in a photograph, it looked oddly small behind glass. Without snow, without the weight of a cartridge in his hand, without the sound of engines drifting through trees, it could have been mistaken for any other oversized firearm. But in his mind, whenever he looked at that barrel, he could still hear the muted sound of loaders whispering ranges, feel the earth kicking under recoil, and see the moment when steel that had seemed unstoppable faltered, if only for a few seconds. Enough, sometimes, to tip the balance of a ridge, a road, or a village. The story of the PTRD also offers a quieter lesson about how armies think, and sometimes misthink, about technology. Before the war, many Soviet planners had believed that anti-tank rifles were on the verge of irrelevance. They expected armored protection to outpace what a soldier with a shoulder-fired weapon could challenge. In response, they focused their energy and resources on developing heavier guns and more advanced vehicles. Then reality intervened. Surprise attack, rapid advances, lost artillery, unprepared positions. Under those conditions, an imperfect tool that could be produced quickly and in volume proved more useful than a perfect tool that was still on the drawing board. The decision to resurrect the anti-tank rifle concept and push it into mass production did not emerge from neat theoretical debates. It emerged from urgency and a willingness, in a moment of crisis, to reconsider ideas that had recently been labeled outdated. On the German side, a mirrored pattern appeared. Their intelligence analysts collected data about Soviet equipment through captured samples, battlefield observation, and interrogation. They knew about certain anti-tank guns, about minefields, about the stubbornness of Soviet defense in depth. Early appearances of heavy anti-tank rifles were noted, but interpreted through existing frameworks, light armor threats, short-range hazards, nuisance weapons. Even as reports accumulated suggesting that something more capable was at work, unusual track failures, penetrations in unexpected locations, engine damage attributed to small caliber, high-velocity fire, the most natural explanation remained anchored to prior expectations: grenades, mines, artillery fragments. This tendency to fit new data into old models is not unique to one army or one era. It is a feature of human cognition. We see what we believe we are likely to see, until the evidence piles up so high that ignoring it becomes more costly than revising our assumptions. The PTRD occupied that grey zone between old and new, effective and outdated. Had the war begun 2 years later, with even heavier armor fields and more widespread shape-charge weapons, its window of effectiveness might have been much narrower. Had it begun 2 years earlier, when lighter tanks were still common, the weapon might have seemed more obviously necessary from the beginning, and less like a desperate improvisation. As it stands, its story sits at the intersection of industrial capability, doctrinal flexibility, and the practical realities of a vast, fast-moving conflict. In classrooms and staff colleges after the war, instructors would use examples like this to illustrate the importance of planning not only for a single, idealized future, but for a range of possibilities. They would point out how tools dismissed as late or insufficient in one context can become critical if circumstances change. At the same time, they would caution against the opposite mistake, clinging to familiar tools long after their moment has passed, simply because they performed well in the last crisis. The rifleman, who never sat through those lectures, had learned a simpler version of the same lesson in the snow. He had seen the PTRD arrive as something many considered an oddity, watched it prove its worth in the hardest months, and then, later, watched as its dominance faded in the face of thicker armor and better alternatives. He understood, instinctively, that no single weapon decided the war, not his rifle, not any particular tank, not any one plane. What decided it was the constant, messy process of adaptation, designers rethinking old ideas, factories retooling, commanders revising tactics, and, at the smaller scale, individual soldiers figuring out how to make the most of what they had in front of them. His ridiculous rifle had been one such adaptation. It had arrived awkwardly, performed fiercely when conditions favored it, and then yielded the center stage to newer systems. Along the way, it had changed how one side advanced and how the other side defended, leaving a mark that did not always show up neatly on charts, but could be traced in memories and in the subtle ways doctrine shifted on both sides. There is one more perspective worth considering, that of the young soldiers who first received the PTRD in later stages of the war, when its reputation had already begun to spread. Unlike the rifleman who had laughed at it in training, they came to the weapon expecting it to be important. They had heard stories, some exaggerated, some not, about long-range hits, tanks stuck on slopes, vehicles halted at bridges by shots that found exactly the right point of impact. For them, the rifle was never a joke. It was a badge of responsibility. When they felt its weight on their shoulders, they carried not just steel, but the accumulation of all those earlier engagements. Their first shots in combat were shaped by techniques passed down from crews who had learned the hard way when to fire and when to hold. In that sense, the PTRD's greatest transformation was not in its physical form, but in how it existed in the minds of the people who used and faced it. It moved from being an underestimated curiosity to a recognized factor, not the hero of every fight, but a piece on the board that could no longer be ignored. If you walk into a military museum today and see a PTRD standing in a corner display, it can be easy to underestimate it. It does not have the immediate presence of a tank, the sweeping wings of a bomber model, or the complex silhouette of a self-propelled gun. It looks, at first glance, like an oversized hunting rifle that someone forgot to scale correctly. There are no moving dioramas showing it in action. No towering plaques listing all the battles it turned by itself. It stands quietly, a long line of metal and wood behind glass, perhaps with a small label giving its designation, caliber, and dates of service. Yet behind that quiet object is a story about what happens when simple tools are placed in the hands of determined people at exactly the moment when they are needed most. It is the story of a young rifleman on a frozen ridge near Vyazma, lining up his sights on a silhouette he had been trained to fear, and watching it slow and halt under the impact of a single round. It is the story of loaders whose hands went numb from holding heavy cartridges in winter air, who learned to move in sync with a weapon that demanded time and teamwork for every shot. It is the story of German crews who began the war secure in the belief that anti-tank rifles were relics, and who gradually learned, through damaged tracks and immobilized vehicles, that there were still narrow spaces where long, simple barrels could reach them. It is the story of commanders and designers revisiting old ideas under pressure, choosing practicality over pride, and accepting that sometimes yesterday's concepts, reworked under new conditions, can fill gaps until more advanced solutions arrive. In the title of this video, we call it the ridiculous rifle that became a nightmare. That word, ridiculous, captures the way it first appeared to many who saw it. Too long, too heavy, too slow, built for a contest that, on paper, armor had already won. The nightmare part did not come from any single statistic in a technical manual. It came from the way those long barrels appeared again and again, in unexpected places, at inconvenient times, undermining assumptions about where tanks could go and how safely they could move. No weapon exists in isolation. The PTRD was part of a larger whole: mines, guns, artillery, aircraft, and, above all, the people who learned to coordinate them. It did not stop every tank, or even most tanks, but it did enough, often enough, to matter. In industrial war, that is usually how change really happens. Not through one perfect invention that rewrites all the rules at once, but through countless smaller adjustments that chip away at old certainties until the overall picture looks different. The PTRD chipped away at the idea of invulnerable armor during a time when that idea, if left unchallenged, might have carried German spearheads much farther east than they ultimately reached. It bought hours, days, and sometimes only minutes at a time. Those minutes gave other weapons time to be brought up, gave retreats time to turn into organized defenses, and gave infantry time to believe that they were not entirely at the mercy of steel. For the rifleman who once crawled through snow with its weight digging into his shoulder, those minutes were not abstract. They were the difference between seeing tanks crest the ridge behind him and seeing them stall just short. If you listen closely to that quiet corner of the museum, you can almost hear the echo of its report, the intake of breath before each shot, and the hush that fell over more than one battlefield when armor that had been certain of its path suddenly found itself stuck, engines racing in place, while a long barrel somewhere on a ridge slid back into the snow to prepare for whatever came next.